The way an RFA worker approaches the interview is paramount to a potential resource family's experience and success. The RFA worker conducting the interview must remember and acknowledge they are representing and playing a role in a powerful system of child welfare and, by proxy, the state. Many families have had previous experiences with governmental systems and not all of them positive. A family may have some understandable hesitation pouring out their intimate life stories to a stranger seeming to be a cog in a bureaucratic wheel of human services. It is essential that the clinician approach each interview with these considerations in mind and work towards building engagement, setting aside their potential biases, using a strengths-based and trauma-informed lens, and practicing cultural humility.
How to address whether something is kind of a red flag because we have a gut instinct about it, or whether there's some bias informing that, and how to parse that out, right? And how to do that is through behaviorally based assessment. There is a lovely little, if we move on here, there's this little acronym that called STITCH that at least is helpful, or can be helpful to remember the core ideas that we want to work with when we're writing an assessment, right? Well, number one is to be strengths-based. Families are going to be reading these, which is quite different than it used to be, at least how it used to be, how we did it at Seneca. So throughout the way, even when we're introducing families to the idea that we're writing this family evaluation, we're going to be transparent throughout the whole process and writing from a strengths-based perspective. So, how do we operationalize that? What does that mean? We throw strengths-based around a lot in the field of mental health, right? Anybody care to take a gander? It's sort of self-explanatory. It can be sort of self-explanatory. So, what that really entails is we're looking at the thought of screening in versus screening out, right? So when we are looking at a family and something might look like odd or different to us, to have curiosity around that and work from a strengths-based perspective, right? Like how is this maybe something that the family can either harness as a strength, or how can I mitigate this so that we're focusing on what are the family's strengths that can help, solve this, either whether it's a problem or, if you give me an example of a concern, for example, the family has experienced loss around infertility. They had a lot of they expressed that they went to therapy around it, that they, that you observe that they have great communication skills between the couple, that they really have been open. So those are strengths that we want to draw upon when we're trying to mitigate a concern around, this family has experienced a lot of loss, right? They're really great communicators. And as we go through it, we'll be, we don't want anything to be a surprise to the family when they get approved or recommended or not recommended, right? That we're talking about things that are concerning along the way. Another part of this little STITCH acronym is trauma informed.
Can I go back
to
sure.
Strengths-based? Thank you.
Something that that I heard in a training for SAFE, the SAFE study, that I really am mindful of is even being mindful of the language that we use to describe families when we're conferencing or consulting, with our supervisor or our team. We may be very well intentioned and present in our evaluation to the family very strengths-based, but when we've been talking about it and processing and kind of consulting about it, what is the language that we're using to describe certain challenges or concerns that are there? Because that really does help inform how we're really looking at it and then assessing it and then writing it down. And one of the examples that the trainer gave that I just really hold on to is even the term red flags, what are the red flags? That already has a negative connotation, and shifting it to be, what makes me curious? What are the things that are really making me curious about what they're saying? And that really just starts from the ground level and how we are really viewing whatever may be concerning as an experience that a family or an individual went through and has an impact. And it doesn't necessarily have to be negative or positive, but there was an experience and a result. So what is it about that that is making me curious to find out more, and how will that impact their parenting?
Yeah, thank you. No, that was great. I appreciate that you said that you called that out. And even, as I think, like, to myself, a helpful reminder is how would I read this being written about me? And, particularly around things that our society deems as, quote, negative, and someone, being impacted by a problem rather than, so-and-so is a drug addict, right? That type of language, like, how would you like to see you or or a family member, because I know that if you were to I'm a parent now, I have 2 kids, and if you were to just write about the worst things that happened in my life so far, I might not pass. I might not be recommended. If you just took, like, all the terrible things I did in my high school and in my 20s, and then we're forced to make a judgment upon that, right?
The RFA worker must gather critical information in a timely manner, and to do so, the preparation and engagement process requires a framework based in a strengths-based, trauma-informed lens with cultural humility at the center.
So there were things that in my 8-week orientation process before I actually started, not once was the impact of trauma talked about in terms of children actually being removed from their families of origin, and how, like, trauma behaviors and the psychobiology of the brain, that is a more recent kind of push and awareness that's really being implemented in our counties and in our practice. And so even within 10 years, even though that information was there, it wasn't as widespread as it is now, and it's starting to be, and now, kind of being rolled out in schools and everything, which is amazing. But there is still a lack of education that really exists in terms of understanding not just, you were physically abused and you're gonna have some behaviors as a result, but really understanding how neglect impacts a brain's development. Like, a child who has been in a neglectful environment, their brain is smaller. So, like, those pieces of really intricate details that we're all, just as professionals, really diving into and getting to know, the random person off of the street is not going to know that. They're not going to really be able to understand that this child's brain is wired differently because of what they've experienced in utero, their first early childhood years, and how their behaviors are going to show us that it's wired differently. And so I think the education and just really diving into, like, what families' understanding of trauma is and how that impacts the development of the brain cannot be overeducated, because these families need to have tools and understanding in order to be fully aware, first of all, and feel like they're equipped to be able to handle some of those behaviors, and to have the hope of you can change the biology, the neurobiology of their brain by giving them these positive, nurturing, loving, consistent, structured experiences. And by playing with your child helps change the impact of that early childhood trauma. So, and I know that there is that, of course, there's the RFA training, there's the 2-hour component of additional training that can be catered to the specific needs of the family and where you might think they need a little bit more education. But I just really, maybe it's because part of my role is I do trainings for parents. I can't separate that, because they need to know, they need to be equipped, and they need to be able to connect with resources that are going to be able to help them parent in a trauma-informed way.
In preparing for the interview, the RFA worker needs to review the family's existing file and discuss any pertinent information and/or circumstances with their supervisor in order that they understand where the process a family might be and for whom the family is seeking to provide care. For example, are they a relative caregiver or an unmatched family? When engaging the family, practice cultural humility. Be flexible around their work schedules and preferences for setting an interview time. Note any holidays or other observed practices or rituals so the process does not conflict with their family norms. When stepping into the family home, observe and ask whether shoes are permitted or where you can sit down. Acknowledge the intrusive nature of the interview and state this is a mutual interview where feedback is encouraged. Be supportive of their needs and questions about this process and follow up on these. Acknowledge areas of difference and potential for bias in order to collaborate on keeping these from hindering the evaluation process. State our role as a helper in this endeavor. When conducting the interview, don't be afraid to be transparent about observations and questions or concerns. This may also have the desired outcome of helping to build trust with the family, which is important when considering the sensitive nature of many of the topics covered. Don't be embarrassed to ask a family to educate you if you don't know something about the culture or expectations. Remember that these evaluations are shared with the family, so they will need to be conceptualized and written with that knowledge and awareness as though you are imagining reading this information about yourself. The goal is to be inclusive and not exclusive. The family has stepped up to commit to a child, and this must be honored with the dignity it warrants. If there is a question around a potential difference in value or culture or even perceived risk, the RFA workers should first be curious about this difference as an antidote to bias. The RFA worker should be noting nonverbal observations as well as being attuned to how the family is answering questions. Are the responses terse? If so, is it a sensitive topic, and how is it approached? Be mindful of sensitive topics and how generational or other cultural factors might impact what is considered private. Ask yourself the question first: how does getting this information relate to the family's current ability to care for a child?
There's some really, deep stuff that we got to ask families about, and some of you have already listed, some of them. But what are some other of those kind of sensitive topics or issues that you have to ask about that is frankly intrusive and maybe scary, and you don't know how to go about doing that? So yeah, substance abuse history. How are you going to get home? It's a very relative topic. What else?
About child abuse, abuse of the child, and then especially when there's sexual abuse.
Infertility, or or loss around children.
I think also applicants who have grown up in foster care. I've read a lot of reports in RFA, and those seem to be the sensitive spots.
Yeah, it's also a big motivator for people to care for children in the system, and in an area of strength in that. I mean, it can be both and, right?
What else?
Money.
Yeah, finances.
I think when you have had workers interview same-sex couples and talking about the applicant's history or experience as a child as gay or lesbian and not being accepted by the parent, and then now they want to be resource parents for the youth who identify as LGBT.
Definitely. We've worked with some families who there's one of the parents is transgender, and do we talk about? I mean, they're presenting. This is how they're presenting, and yet this is a big aspect of their history. And what are the family involvements and supports or not? And how do we write about that in a way that they're comfortable with, and maybe they never want to go there in talking about, what sex they were born as, and then how they identify, and also with gender identity as well. And then what pronouns do we use? Are we asking everybody what pronouns we should refer to them as, both in person and written down? Or will, Grandpa look at you like you you kidding me? Right? Like, we have to think about that too. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of that because you want to be sensitive to what their experience is, but not dance around it.
Well, that's why for things like that we really want to be asking everybody and normalizing that, like having something written where, you know, preferred pronoun is in the like demographic packet that we put out, and that way it doesn't have to be that like potentially awkward, like in almost everybody, right? Like grandpa who's like, what's a preferred pronoun? You're looking at you like you're, you know, you have a screw loose, or someone else that you might risk being like, what do you mean, you know?
The mandatory critical components that need to be evaluated for the RFA family evaluation are as follows. 1. Motivation to become a resource family. 2. Relationship to child if applicable. 3. Childhood upbringing and experiences. 4. Adulthood experiences and personal characteristics. 5. Risk assessment. 6. Current relationships. 7. Parenting experiences, practices, and discipline methods. 8. Discussion of the background check results. 9. Discussion of any services needed by applicant to meet RF responsibilities. 10. Employment. 11. Financial situation. These categories of information can be broad, and the state has intentionally left the specifics of interview questions to the discretion of county jurisdictions and to RFA workers to be responsive and ask appropriate questions that are relevant and tailored to the individual applicants. What this means is that we need to be attuned to the information we are seeking. What we are looking for from families in each of these domains is the knowledge or ability to demonstrate an understanding of the following: the safety, permanence, protection, and well-being needs of children and non-minor dependents who have been victims of child abuse or neglect, the needs and development of children and non-minor dependents, effective parenting skills or knowledge of parenting, a resource family's role and capacity to work cooperatively with the agency, birth parents, extended family, and other services providers in implementing the child's needs and services plan, an ability and willingness to do the following: meet the needs of children and non-minor dependents, make use of support resources offered by agency or by a support structure put in place, prepare a child for adulthood or to prepare a non-minor dependent for transition to independent living, honor the natural connections of a child or non-minor dependent, and support permanency plans for a child or non-minor dependent, including reunifications, and help prepare a child or non-minor dependent for permanent or provide permanency. In order to do this, we use behaviorally based questions to minimize subjective and abstract interpretations and focus on concrete observations and behaviors to support a family's narratives. Note, before you ask a question, that we are only seeking knowledge pertaining to how this story or piece of information impacts their current ability to parent a child. Some examples of behaviorally based questions for each component might include motivation to become a resource family. How did you make the decision to become a resource family? What prompted you to pursue becoming a resource parent at this time? Tell me about your first conversations about becoming a resource parent. Who brought it up? What was your partner or spouse's initial response? Has this changed over time? Tell me about a time that you entered into something when your expectations were not met. What was it? What was your response? What was the outcome? Relationship to child, if applicable. Gather information regarding the relationship with the child currently and history of contact. Childhood upbringing and experiences. What did communication look like in your family growing up? Describe a traumatic time in your life. How did this impact you as a child? Does this continue to have an impact on you? If so, how? Give me a brief description of your childhood. Who raised you? Were you separated from your primary caregivers? What were the most significant experiences you had in childhood? Adult experiences and personal characteristics. Tell me about a time that you've experienced a high level of stress and how did you manage it? Tell me about the ending of a significant relationship in your life. How has this affected you and your other relationships? What did you need after that person's death or permanent absence from your family? Tell me about a time you felt out of control emotionally. Describe how you processed these feelings and worked through the situation. Briefly describe your significant adult experiences. Describe your personality, including strengths. Tell me about a time you experienced a dramatic change in your life. How did you feel? Who did you turn to? Risk assessment. Substance abuse. What has been your past substance use? Do you currently use substances? If so, which ones and how often? Do you feel you have ever had a problem with substances? If so, share what steps you took to overcome the substance abuse. Physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and family domestic violence history. Do you consider yourself to have been physically, emotionally, or sexually abused as a child, teen, or adult? Is there a history of domestic violence in your family? If yes to any of the above, when did it begin? Did it involve immediate family members? What did you do at the time? Did you receive support? From who? What steps did you take to process this experience? How does it impact you now and today? Are you aware of any triggers? If so, what are a few? What would be your reaction or response if the child in your home disclosed similar abuse to what you experienced? How would you respond verbally? What follow-up actions would you take to support the child or youth? If you have a partner, are they aware of any triggers? Provide brief education to applicant if needed and see if applicant is open and responsive. If so, it's a strength. Physical and mental health. Describe your physical health, past and current. Have you ever experienced any mental health issues? If so, how is it currently impacting you? Current relationships. How do you know when your partner is in distress? What do you do when you recognize this? Tell me about a time when you have needed help and you reached out to your support system. How was that experience for you? How did your support system respond? Describe your current relationship status. Tell me about your history together. How did you meet your partner? How long have you been together? What drew you to each other? Are there areas in which you strongly disagree? How do you manage or resolve disputes? If single, describe your dating relationships and current activity related to dating. What are your plans for going through this process in dating? Expectations for introducing a new partner? Parenting experiences, practices, and discipline methods. Tell me about a time that you felt you made a parenting mistake. What was it? How did you respond at that time, and what would you do differently? Can you give me an example of a time when you helped an adult or child through an emotional experience and what was the outcome? What has been your experience in knowing or caring for a child that has been through significant trauma? What did you observe and understand about this trauma impacted the child's growth and development? Describe your parenting experience. What do you enjoy about it? What do you dislike? Describe how you typically discipline your children. What discipline strategies are you most comfortable with? Describe your parenting style. What works for you? In what way have you made changes over time? Tell me about a time you made a parenting mistake. If no parenting experience, tell me about a time when you were with a child that misbehaved. What did you do? How did you feel? Tell me about a time when you misbehaved as a child. How did your parents handle it? Would you do something differently? What would you have liked them to do? Describe physical and emotional safety. What would that look like in your home? Tell me about a time you comforted a child who was frightened. Discussion of the background check results. Help me understand what contributed to this situation. What led you to being arrested? How did this impact you at the time? What have you learned from the situation? How has this changed your current behavior to avoid a similar situation from happening? Review results and have applicant disclose history. Use the mitigation questions to determine if concern currently impact parenting ability. Discussion of any services needed by applicant to meet resource family responsibilities. What services or supports have you utilized in the past and what did you find to be helpful? Include any recommendations you have for additional training, resources, or services to strengthen the family and mitigate any concerns. Employment. What is your current employment situation? What does a typical work week schedule look like? When you are feeling overwhelmed at work, how does that impact your home life? Use mitigation questions to evaluate any concerns. Financial situation. Tell me about a time when you've experienced financial stress. How did this impact you? How did you address this situation? Use mitigation questions to determine and evaluate any concern. This is not an exhaustive list, but rather a starting place for the purposes of edification. Your questions will be based on what relationship and knowledge you're able to establish with the family and what your individual county has determined they wish to require. Let's also be mindful of the unique aspects and questions which need to be addressed when interviewing kin and/or children in the home. For example, there may be familial ties which prove to be protective factors. There might also be issues present which may impact the child's relationship with their parents and potential considerations around boundaries for the family, particularly when there are court orders which need to be followed. Consider yourself a grandparent or aunt caring for a child of your daughter or sister, and what that might mean for honoring visitation requirements or restraining orders. In the case of interviewing children, it is imperative we are mindful of their individual developmental stages, as opposed to relying strictly on chronological age, and attuned to their histories and knowledge and understanding of their circumstances. We are concerned primarily with observing and ascertaining their safety and any concerns they might have around the resource family applicant through developmentally appropriate questions. Note, this is not a psychological evaluation of the family or a biography. The family evaluation only needs to be concerned with that which is directly relevant to the person's ability to meet the requirements detailed in the critical components section, and all questions should be asked with this framework in mind.